The next example I want to talk about is the notion of the Big Bang. As you know, in the 1920s, perhaps, cosmologists and astrophysicists came up with a brand new theory about how the universe and our sun and our planets were created. And this was the theory of the Big Bang. This theory, by the way, did not exist in the 1800s, for example. This was a product of the 20th century science. It was mainly the product of general relativity, the work of Albert Einstein. And the proof, in a sense, that the universe as we see it today, to the best of our knowledge, and Allah knows best, if it follows the laws of physics we believe that it follows, it must have started in the Big Bang. The idea came in the early 20th century. The mathematical proof that if what we believe about the universe is correct, then a Big Bang must have been the beginning, was developed in the 1960s by two scientists, Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose out of England. So we're talking very recent stuff, that everything was smushed together in one super dense ball of energy that exploded and produced eventually the stars and the earth and so on. When you read either the biblical account of creation or the Aristotelian system of creation, things were created in pieces. And so if you read Genesis, you know, God creates the heavens and then he creates the earth. They are entirely sort of separate phenomena, and you build this piece and build that piece and build that piece. The theory of the Big Bang said, no, everything had a common origin, and then this explosion took place and then eventually produced everything that we see. So then we sort of learn something about the Big Bang, and then we read in Surah Al-Anbiya that the Quran is saying, أَوَلَمْ يَرَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا أَنَّ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ كَانَتَا رَتْقًا فَفَتَقْنَاهُمَا. Do not the unbelievers see, and a very interesting beginning, do not the unbelievers see that the heavens and the earth were joined together as one unit of creation before we cleaved them asunder. And so when we now study the Big Bang, this makes perfect sense in terms of the Big Bang. And I just want to play one very brief snippet for you to illustrate.
The Big Bang. Stars and galaxies, planets and life. Time and space itself came from a single point. It seems an unlikely proposition. How could the universe, in all its variety and complexity, have come from one common primal source?
But that is the current understanding today, which is entirely consistent with what the Quran says. 200 years ago, this verse couldn't have been appreciated in this light. We didn't know. Another very interesting corollary of the Big Bang is the notion of the expanding universe. As you know, when the Big Bang occurred, it was a huge explosion and all matter was sent sort of hurtling outward, and the universe now remains expanding, so that the galaxies are moving away from each other. The stars are moving away from each other. And with time, they grow further and further apart. And the example that textbooks usually use for the galaxies is take a balloon and paint a bunch of dots on its surface, and then start blowing the balloon up, and the dots will move apart on the surface of the balloon. And that is precisely what is happening to the galaxies in our universe. And that is a direct corollary of the Big Bang. It's a result of the Big Bang. This notion of the expanding universe, by the way, we now may take it for granted, but it is a very revolutionary idea. It was considered scientific heresy when it first sort of came up. And as I told you, these models of cosmology and the Big Bang and so on were the product of Albert Einstein's conception of the theory of general relativity. But when Einstein conceived and finally sort of discovered, in a sense, the theory of general relativity, he had one huge problem. This was in 1912, 1915, 1917, 1919. Various bits and pieces, various papers on general relativity began appearing from Albert Einstein. So between 1912 and 1920, he had pretty much fully formulated the theory, and he faced one huge obstacle. The theory made sense in so many ways, but it seemed that the universe couldn't be static. The universe couldn't be as it is. It had to either be expanding or contracting. The equations of general relativity were contradictory to the notion of a static universe. And Albert Einstein was terribly puzzled because everyone in that day, even the brightest and leading scientists, were absolutely convinced that the universe was static. It is as we see it and is not changing. So he tried to rework the equations, and kept coming up with the same result. So finally, he just pulled out of the air a fudge factor. It was called the cosmological constant. He came up with something called the cosmological constant to force the equations to be static. It's like you keep coming up with the answer -2, and you say, okay, well, the answer can't be -2, so I'm going to add 2 to it to make it 0. But you have no reason to add the 2. And he introduced the idea of the cosmological constant in his equations of general relativity. In 1929, the American astronomer Edwin Hubble made and that's why we have the Hubble telescope and the Hubble Observatory and so on, named after this giant in astronomy, made an amazing discovery, that the universe is expanding, based on observations, not based on scientific theory. And Hubble's data was checked and rechecked, and it turned out to be right. The universe was expanding. It wasn't static. And Hubble went on to win the Nobel Prize for this amazing discovery. And when Albert Einstein heard of Hubble's discovery, he said, well, of course, yes, my equations showed that the universe was expanding, and I introduced the cosmological constant, and he said that this was the biggest mistake of my entire life, because he actually theoretically could have beaten Hubble and made the revolutionary leap that the universe was expanding. And so then we read in the Quran, in Surah Al-Dhariyat, وَالسَّمَاءَ بَنَيْنَاهَا بِأَيْدٍ وَإِنَّا لَمُوسِعُونَ. And the heavens we have built with power and force, and we are expanding it. Okay? Amazing, amazing that this is coming out 1,500 years ago, because the conception, every person who knew anything about science would have been willing to bet their life or reputation that this was not the case.